Ron, would you direct our minds in prayer, please? Amen. Okay, so we'll conclude study in Nehemiah, and then Sunday morning it'll be chapters 1 through 3 in Daniel. Is that correct? Okay. And we get Adam back, so yay. All right, so as a refresher, who was Nehemiah? He was a cupbearer for Artaxerxes, Persian king. And news comes to him about Jerusalem, and was it good news, bad news? Bad news. What was his reaction? He mourned and wept. One of the things I found particularly interesting that just kind of struck me today when I was going over the lesson again was this book opens and closes on Nehemiah's reactions to the state of Jerusalem. That had never really dawned on me before. So he's very sad and very distraught at the beginning of the book. By chapter 13, how is he? Is he happy? By chapter 13, is Nehemiah happy about the condition of Israel in Jerusalem? Yeah, he's still pretty frustrated with what's going on there. So, and instead of being like upset to the point of weeping, he is upset to the point of he's just going to have to snatch a knot in some folks' head. I mean, it's like his title changes from Nehemiah the cupbearer to Nehemiah the ear boxer, because it's getting down to the point where he is so righteously angry about what some of the people are doing at that point, and they know better. Especially considering where we concluded on Sunday morning. So he comes to Jerusalem to do what specifically? To build the walls and to hang the gates. Does he run into any opposition? Oh yeah. We got a couple of great guys, Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite. And they are the ones who really cause him most of the problems, and some of the others that they stir up. What is one of the other things that he has to deal with that's going on among the people? He's got this outside influence, these interlopers that are trying to upset what he's going to do. What's the condition that's going on among the people? Okay, there's foreign wives, but at this point, initially, what has happened? Yeah, the ruling classes is taking advantage of those who are not as well off as they are. They're having to place themselves in indentured servitude, so to speak, marry off their daughters, and things like that, sell their property in order just to live, and Nehemiah has an issue with that. We talked about the fact that intermarriage is an issue, and that led to their downfall and their going astray into idolatry. But one of the things they were also condemned for, and why they went into captivity, was for their treatment of the poor, for taking advantage of those who were less advantaged. So he gets that ironed out. He still has to deal with some issues. Sanballat particularly is very open about the fact that he wants to attack them while they're trying to meet their goal and get the walls rebuilt and the gates hung, to the point that how are they having to go about accomplishing that? Yep. Sword in one hand, brick, trowel, mortar, whatever in the other. And they're just working around the clock to get this accomplished, to get the gates hung. How long does it take them? 52 days. So they were hammering, literally, to get this accomplished, and they did. Following that, once they get that done, what takes place? Okay? There's a register that's made, but they bring forth Ezra the scribe and have him do what? Read the law. How long did they read the law? At least 4 hours. And they were like, it was like a picnic. They had blankets out. They were on the ground, with their feet up, looking at the sky, going, I've never heard that before. That's pretty cool. They stood. That's a long time. And they were so struck by it, what kind of effect did it have on them? Yeah, they were sad and crying. And so the following day, some of the leaders meet with Ezra and they go through a reading of the law again, and what do they find out? A lot of stuff they hadn't been doing. One thing in particular that just happened to coincide with the fact that it was the 7th month was Feast of Booths. And they were like, hey, that works out great. We're going to do that. So they observed the Feast of Booths. Following that, they enter into a formal covenant, which we went over that Sunday morning in chapter 9. They look back at their history. A number of things are called to remembrance about what God had done for them, the way they had behaved in their covenant toward God, and the fact that God had continued to deal mercifully with them up until a point where he would punish them, then he would deliver them when they cried out. And he'd punish them, he'd deliver them, and then finally, you know what, you just got to be punished. And just stew in it for a while. But then he brings them back, this remnant, into the land. And so they conclude in chapter 9, they end this up stating, take note of our plot. You've been merciful to us in the past. You see how things still aren't that great for us now. But we pledge ourselves to this covenant. In other words, we're going to be your people, we're going to be faithful, and we're going to honor it in the future, here on out. And so that's where we're at now. So beginning in chapter 10, and we're probably going to sit down in chapter 13 tonight. But chapter 10, we have those who sealed the covenant formally. The first 27 verses. This is really comprised of the leaders and the Levites and the priests. We see that Nehemiah is mentioned as being governor. There are 22 priestly names that are given. 17 Levites altogether. I think it totals up to like 44 individuals that are mentioned in all. Then we get to verses 28 and 29. And it says there, now the rest of the people, the priests and the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nethinim, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the land to to the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding, these joined with their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his ordinance and his statutes. What does that remind you of? Into not only a covenant, but a curse. Yes, and what was one of the things they did when they did that? Yes, you had a group that stood on one mountainside and a group that stood on the other mountainside, and one group called out the curses and the other group called out the blessings of the covenant and such. What was there more of? What was there more of? Blessings or curses? If I remember right, I have to go back and check, but I think there are about twice as many curses as there are blessings. And I guess they needed that to really drive the point home. They were pretty specific with some of those curses too. But this is to motivate them. You know, just the fact that they are in a covenant relationship with God, and they've just been reminded of how merciful he's been toward them and gracious, and the fact that they're pleading to him to be merciful to them again now and help them in this situation, you would think that that would be enough. But every coin has two sides. So with the blessings of a covenant, there also comes a curse. There comes consequences for violating that. And so that has to be touched upon. But the idea is this is to motivate them in their walk in God's law so that they observe and do all his commandments, all his ordinances, all his statutes. This is really, really important for them. And they need to understand it, and they need to engage in that. And so the concluding verses, 30 through 39, we have stipulations that are given in the covenant. What's the first stipulation given in verse 30? No intermarriage. Does this really need to be specified? Apparently so, because it's already happened. So, stress that. Verse 31, we see that they need to refuse to purchase wares from foreign merchants on the Sabbath. In other words, there's not supposed to be any commerce that day, but especially not with foreigners, particularly, or on any holy days. It also mentions that they are supposed to observe the sabbatical year. Wasn't that one of the reasons why they went into captivity, for not doing that? Well, you need to remember, this is part of the covenant. It was originally. That still holds true. That needs to be observed. There needs to be an annual contribution of 1/3 of a shekel to supply the temple sacrifices. There are families that are supposed to supply wood for the altar by lot that's drawn. Yes, sir. No, I never put that together. That's interesting. Good call. Verses 35 through 39, we see that they are supposed to give God the first fruits of everything. And there's something I want you to note here. That also includes provision for the Levites as well as the priests, the gatekeepers, and the singers. They're supposed to pay a tithe to the Levites. The Levites were the ones collecting it. From that, the Levites give a tithe to the priest that's supposed to go to the temple. Well, that tithe for the Levites, which is also kind of spread out through the gatekeepers and the singers and all, that's for their provision. That's to help them live. We're going to see how that plays a role here in a little bit. And then lastly, verse 39, they are not to neglect God's house, not to neglect his temple. Thoughts or comments on any of that? Okay, chapter 11. Chapter 11 is really just kind of like a statistics kind of chapter. It records those who figured prominently in the resettlement. This may have been to give honor to those that it was due, or to trace the community's roots back to its past, and to stress that they were organized to carry out the calling, that they were to be a kingdom of priests, that they're a holy nation. This is, I think, probably could go to remind them of that. So in the 24 verses that are there, the very first thing that's addressed is the population inside the city. What do we know about the population inside the city? Was everybody just kind of like crammed in there? No, it was very sparse. There was probably more people living outside the walls than there were living in the city. So this needs to be addressed. And what did they do about that? They cast lots. So 1 out of every 10 would relocate into the city. You had those who volunteered to participate, and they were blessed according to that. Then the register includes the number of the sons of Benjamin. There's like 468. Of Benjamin there's 928. Of Judah there's 468. There's 822 priests, 284 Levites, and 172 gatekeepers. So they're fleshing it out. Artaxerxes commands that provisions be given for the temple singers. I guess he's specific to that. And then Pethahiah of Judah is kind of put in charge as the king's representative to the people to make sure this stuff is followed. So there's not a whole lot of detail in this chapter. But anybody have anything they want to add, contribute? Okay. We'll just move on to chapter 12. Okay. In chapter 12, again, we have a list here. This kind of includes the original immigrants that came back in. In the days of Jeshua the high priest, this would be probably the first generation restoration. There were about 22 heads of the priestly families altogether, and 8 heads of the Levitical families are named. When you compare this to the list that Ezra gives, he only mentions 3. So we see that Nehemiah gets a little more detailed here, and one of the things I mentioned Sunday morning is that maybe Ezra's list might have been compiled prior to leaving Babylon, and Nehemiah's is compiled. Verses 10 through 11 speaks of the high priest family. It's a selective list. It runs from Jeshua down to Jaddua, I think is how you pronounce it. And it ends with those who are active in the days of Darius II, which was about 423 to 404 BC. And it's during his reign that it's thought that Nehemiah passed away. Jaddua, interestingly enough, Josephus names the high priest who received Alexander the Great as being Jaddua. It may be this same guy, and it could be that at this time in Darius's reign, he was an infant, but he's listed because he will eventually become the high priest, and he just happens to be the one that meets Alexander the Great. I don't know, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Verses 12 through 21, you have a listing of the second generation of priestly family. Verses 22 through 26, you have the Levitical families of Nehemiah's day. And then we get to verses 27 through 43. And what takes place here? dedication of the wall. Is this a big ceremony, or did they just kind of gather together and, oh, there it is, we did it, and back to work? Yeah, they had purification rituals that were held for the Levites and for the gates and for the wall. They divided into two groups that would walk the wall in opposite directions. And Ezra's in one group, Nehemiah's in the other. So each group had a choir. Nehemiah's group had about half the officials. Ezra's group had about half the princes. There were 7 priests with trumpets in Nehemiah's group in verse 41. You've got 7 priests with trumpets that are named in Ezra's group. And then there are 8 singers in Nehemiah's group, and there are 8 instrumentalists in Ezra's group. So they had a ritual procession that went around the wall. And where did it wind up? Various gates. Were the people happy? Yeah, absolutely. Verse 43 says, also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. Tobiah and Sanballat to miss out on all the celebration. We want them to know that every effort they made to forestall this failed. And don't you imagine if they were standing outside, that just grated them to hear this celebration, to hear the joy that is being expressed by these people that they're being led in. And I hope it did. I hope it flew all over them, but that's me. And then lastly, in verses 44 through 47, you have furthering contributions. There's collections that are made for the temple. There's purification rituals of law of Moses and musical arrangements from the days of David and Solomon that are performed. So it is just absolutely a joyous time. They have accomplished a physical and a spiritual goal. But we know that the building of the temple was a physical and a spiritual goal, but so was this. This is intended to help secure God's people, to reroot them in this area. So that's absolutely also a spiritual goal. And they reached it with his help. And by all means, it is celebratory. Okay, and then this is where I kind of want to sit down. And I probably got here a little faster than I wanted to, but it's a lot of lists in this lesson. I'm too thick-tongued to read all those names out loud. Okay. So beginning in the first 3 verses, we have, on the day that they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. And so it was that they had heard the law, when they had heard the law, that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. Didn't we do something like this already? Wasn't this an issue that Ezra had to deal with? But here we are again. They read the book of the law. We see why it specified that they weren't to have anything to do with Ammon and Moabite. Is this a separation that is stressed because of ethnicity? It's out of history. And it's out of religion. Because what had the Moabites and the Ammonites tried to do? Yes. What bright idea did Balaam come up with? He used the foreign women to seduce the Israelite men into idolatry. What kind of people are God's people? They're holy people. They're supposed to be. What kind of people were Moabites and Ammonites? They were pagan, idolatrous, unholy. They were not meant to be included with the people. And this is going to be something that's going to get touched here toward the end of the chapter. So, Nehemiah, at this point, we find out in a couple of verses, has completed his tour here at Jerusalem. Remember, when Artaxerxes agreed to let him go, he asked him, sure, you go handle this. I'll give you letters. I'll send troops with you. How long are you going to be gone? So, Nehemiah told him, and so he had to return back at a certain date. And how long he was there, we don't know. Apparently, it wasn't a real long time. He comes back, and this is what he finds. He finds a series of things that are going wrong. There's failure in sanctity among the people. There is a failure in support. There is a failure to observe the Sabbath. And there is a failure in separation. And what was Nehemiah's reaction to this? Was he just like, guys, I wasn't gone that long. Oh, dude, he was like livid. Who did that remind you of? Absolutely. First thing that came to my mind. Think about the two instances of Christ cleansing the temple. And that is immediately what I kind of thought of Nehemiah here in this instance. In one moment, it's anger and it's threatening. He speaks violence. But then another time, I don't even know that he says anything. He just handles somebody like he says he's going to. So, the failure of sanctity. In verses 4 through 9, what is the situation? That's a good. Yeah, Tobiah's kind of squatting. I don't know. Living there, but he has room. Who gave him that room? The high priest, Elisha, gave him a room there in the temple to store his goods and wares. And Tobiah is an Ammonite. And how do you think he was able to do that? He was wealthy. He was a relative, yes. He had influence. He had contacts. If you remember back in chapter 6 and verses 17 through 19, both he and his son are married into prominent Jewish families. And at one point, he was getting them to send like referral letters, so to speak, to Nehemiah, to like him, to trust him, to include him somehow. Nehemiah wasn't buying it. But now that he's been gone, somehow this deal has gotten finagled. And so he is using a room in the temple. He is essentially welding an ungodly influence in God's house. What does Nehemiah do? Cleans house. He's like, look, dude, this isn't no mini storage. So he drags all of his stuff out, probably piles it right out there for him. Is that enough? Is it enough just to get it out? I had to cleanse it. Wow. You just wouldn't think it would require something like that, but that was how offensive that was. That was how gross that was. It had violated the sanctity of the temple. And that had to be dealt with. Then, in verses 10 through 14, what we have is a failure of support. What's going on here? Yeah. Over in chapter 10 and verses the end of 37 and 38, doesn't it talk about how they're supposed to collect tithes from the people and then give a tenth of that to the high priest for the temple? And this was part of the covenant stipulation. So they've broken that. So they violated the sanctity. They've broken the stipulation of support. What does Nehemiah do about it? Yeah, he holds them accountable. He reprimands them, restores them to their post, the Levites, and he appoints this committee. I think it's interesting, too, that he prays in verse 14, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services. Here's another thing that's interesting to me in this chapter. You know, I talked about when we first started Nehemiah that it contains 9 prayers in there. And Nehemiah is great about just inserting like these little 1-sentence prayers. And I think this chapter has 3, maybe 4 of them just in it. Where it's like after each one of these instances, he recites one of those. Yeah. What? He's trying to lead them to do the right thing. I have a problem with that. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's like a father coming home to a bunch of rambunctious kids. Now I got to be the bad guy. And that's the way Nehemiah is. He's walking into this situation and there's all this stuff going on. And unfortunately, he's the one that's forced to handle it. So then, in verses 15 through 22, one of my favorite parts, what does he find out is happening? They're not observing the Sabbath. Why? What are they doing? Yeah, they're treading out the wine press, buying and selling stuff, and who else is there? Who else is apparently like set up their little kiosk and businesses and stuff just outside the wall. Yeah, the Tyrians. So, kind of violating working on the Sabbath. Wait, what was that covenant stipulation back over in verse 31 of chapter 10? You're not supposed to do business with foreigners on the Sabbath. Ruh-roh. So, we're doing that. And again, in verse 17, here's Nehemiah. I contended with the nobles of Judah, saying to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath? Did not your fathers do this, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It's like, guys, this is part of the reason why we went into captivity. Now you're doing it again. You learn anything. And then continuing it says, and so it was, as the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded that the gates be shut and charged that they must not be open till after the Sabbath. And then I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burden would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. And then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lump your fuzzy lumpkin. That's the way I wish it read. It says, I will lay hands on you. I will manhandle. Nehemiah is not pulling any punches, literally, about this. Well, he does. And we've seen that he's been referenced as the governor. Surely they've got to know he has direct contact with Artaxerxes. He is the cupbearer, after all. I imagine if he wanted to bring some serious weight down on them, he could do it. But I think he is more outdone with the behavior of his people and what they're engaging in. And he's just livid about that. But not only that, there's a corrupting influence that is camping outside the wall, that is enticing them. They need to be gotten rid of. They need to be dealt with. And so he says, and he said, from that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath, and I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates and sanctify the Sabbath day. So we're having to make sure that these folks don't come sneaking around anymore. And then he concludes, remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. And this is almost, to me, like a personal appeal from Nehemiah saying, I hope you won't hold me personally responsible for the actions of these people. I am trying my best to keep them on the straight and narrow, to keep them in the right path. And I also think it's a plea that God give him the strength in doing this and helping him to accomplish this. And then, verses 23 through 29, we have the failure of separation. Well, another covenant stipulation that was given back over in chapter 10 and verse 30. Isn't that funny how those chapters just, here's the stipulations, here we broke every one of them. Given in one chapter, violated in another. It's like they went off a checklist. What were we not supposed to do? Oh yeah, let's go do that. It almost seems the mentality that they have. So the Jews have intermarried with women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Where was Ashdod again? Yeah, that was a Philippian city. Not a Philippian, Philistine city. So, and what has been the result of these intermarriages? Okay, they had children that were half-breed, politically incorrect. Essentially, that's what they were. But they couldn't even speak their language, the Jewish language, at the time. Apparently, they could speak Philistine without any problem. What does that indicate? What kind of grounding are they getting? None. Not true spiritual grounding. I don't know if they're being grounded in idolatry at this point, but it's not far off. You know how I know it's not far off? Because of the example Nehemiah cites. What is Nehemiah's reaction on witnessing this? He gets physical. He gets physical with who? The ones who have done it, the men. He says, and I contended with them. I don't know that means he just got in their face. And he says, I cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair. Look, you want to make a guy fighting mad, pull his hair. But we're men, we're not in a girl fight. You don't pull hair. You just don't. It's degrading. It's embarrassing. And I imagine he's probably grabbing a hold of the hair on their beards and snatching that out. But he says, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? There's the example he cites. Solomon's the one that got us into this. He built all these pagan temples for the idols that his wives worshiped. And from there on, it was downhill. Because he intermarried with women he shouldn't have. You are doing the same thing. And he says, yet among many nations there was no king like him who was beloved of his God. God still loved him. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? Learn from history. Get a clue. He's stressing this to them. On top of all of that, who is one of the prime examples of the people who disobeyed that covenant stipulation? Yeah. It's the priest's son, or grandson, rather. And who? He was the son-in-law of who? Sanballat. Who was Sanballat? Evil guy. He was one of Nehemiah's thorns in the flesh. He was one of his prime adversaries. And the high priest has allowed a grandson of his to marry off into that family. Good grief. And Nehemiah just drove him from me. Yes, sir. He is, man. Elisha's just in cahoots with both those cohorts, isn't he? Tobiah and Sanballat. It's pretty fishy. He ain't much of a high priest, is he? So he drives this guy away. Look what he says in verse 29. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Does that seem kind of like a curse? I mean, blatant. Does he want God to remember them in a good way? No. He's like, do not forget this wrong. Remember them. And he trusts God to handle it in whatever manner he sees fit. He doesn't get specific. He just asks God, remember this, because this is what they're guilty of doing. So he turns it over to God to do that. And then concluding the last two verses, he says, thus I cleanse them of everything pagan. I also assign duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service, and to bringing the wood offering and the first fruits at the appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good. We need strong leaders. Israel, strong leaders. And they had them. God blessed them with that. God blesses us with that. I'm talking in a spiritual sense. But can strong spiritual leaders do everything for us? No. Could they do everything for Israel? No, because there is some personal responsibility at stake. For us today, for them then. And some people just do not seem to get that. And it boggles my mind. And so he concludes this with, remember me, O my God, for good. I did what I could. I did the best that I could. Remember my efforts. Even though apparently you've got those who are intent on straying from them. Now that's not to say that it can our people, the remnant, in a bad light, but the ones that were engaging in this were creating a future problem that needed to be handled right then and right there before it got out of hand and ruined them again. Yes, sir. Right. Well, I'll tell you one thing I need to correct myself on, because I was guilty of this when I was teaching it in the high school class, about the fact that they went off into captivity. It was because of their idolatry and stuff. But when they came back, they never had a problem with idolatry again. Well, they didn't, but almost. It's because they were shooting themselves in the foot. They should have known better, but they were about to get themselves in the very same predicament that they had just been punished for with 70 years of captivity. So I need to remember to correct myself on that next time. All right. Thank you very much.